Welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro FM, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and I am talking today with regular contributor Emily Kornheiser. Hi, Emily.
Good morning, Olga.
Good morning. And still recovering, I suspect, from a very busy week of primaries, we have with us Vermont Secretary of State Jim Condos. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much. It's great to see you both, and good morning to Windham County.
Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, and it is. So, Secretary Condos, I was just on your website for the Secretary of State's office looking at the elections. And one thing I went to was voter turnout, because I'm very curious about that with this primary. So according to your website, and I'm rounding here, I'm rounding up, we have just under 500,000 registered voters, and turnout was just under 175,000. How does that compare to other primaries, given that we put such an emphasis on early voting and mailing in ballots? Did that help or did that hurt?
It absolutely helped. If you look back over history, you'll see that typically we're around 20%, maybe a little more some years, of the checklist for primaries. Keep in mind what a primary is. And I know that Representative Kornheiser knows this well, but a primary really is about party domination elections. It's not about everybody gets to vote, but not about, it's not like the general election, which is a simpler election. In essence, on primary day, we're actually running three separate elections. We're running a Republican election, a progressive election, and a Democratic election. And that is to nominate the people who will represent their parties on the general election ballot. Like I said, it's typically 20 to maybe as high as 25%, depending on the year, but it's typically around 20%, a little over, for of the checklist on that turnout for the primary. This year, we're up around 35%, so there's clearly a very large increase. And I mean, if you actually look at actual numbers, we're talking about over 50,000 more voters this time than any other time in history. The previous high or record of turnout was the 2000 post-civil unions, when we had 122,000 people that turned out for that primary year. The next was 2016, the last presidential year, when we had 120,000. And then in 2018, the off year, we had 107,000. I believe, if my memory serves me correct, all three of those are the top three that we've had. Well, we've smashed that record this week. So, I might get ahead of you a little bit, but the reasons why are multitude. It's not any one factor. Obviously, the fact that we had a pandemic, that we're dealing with that pandemic, my office has been working diligently, literally 50, 60 hours a week for the last 4 months preparing for this. We worked with the legislature to get authority for me to be able to make decisions quickly, nimbly, flexibly, to be able to deal with the effects of COVID. We did, at the time back in March, we had no clue, and I know, Emily, you know this, we had no clue what was in front of us. When we went into lockdown, everybody thought, okay, well, this might be about a month. Well, state employees just last week were told that we're working from home if we can until through at least the end of the year. So it's a pretty significant effect. Obviously, what we've seen around the country has been similar. Wisconsin, about 20 weeks ago, had their state primary. They typically have less than 100,000 absentee voters. They had over 1 million, and they didn't do anything different. That's just the people who requested it. So, and this, we've seen this across the country and other states as well. So clearly the pandemic had a huge effect. Second thing I would say is the fact that we sent out a postcard, absentee request card with postage paid to all active registered voters. That helped as well. That also helped us clean up the checklist a little bit more as well. And then of course, and this is the thing that I always remind people that, you know, the races themselves, the contested races, are sometimes the things that drive turnout. And in this particular primary, it's kind of unusual. We had contested races on both Republican and Democratic governor's races, races on both Republican and Democratic lieutenant governor races. We had some very heavily contested races for state senate up in Chittenden County. We had the state auditor's race was a contested race. So we had many contested races that were out there, and clearly that helps to drive turnout as well.
Thank you, Secretary. Emily, do you have a question?
I want to talk about what this means for the general, but I don't want to get there quite yet. And so picking up on what you said about the contested races, for me, this is primaries, and being in Windham County where we don't often have contested races down here, and we're sort of a Democratic stronghold in a lot of ways. I really think the primaries are such an incredible opportunity for people to talk about the issues. You know, I was talking actually to a family member about, you know, the presidential election, and, you know, people get frustrated with compromise. And the primary is the opportunity when we really get to work through the issues that lead to whatever compromise is on the final ballot, right? And when you participate in that conversation leading up to that compromise, I think people feel a lot more invested in it and can sort of dive in and invest in the general. And so, yeah,
I was just going to say, I'm sorry, Emily, I was just going to say, and keep in mind what we passed a constitutional amendment in 2010 exactly for that purpose, for 17-year-olds to be able to register and vote in primaries if they were going to be 18 by the general election. The feeling was always that those folks should be allowed to have a say in what's going to be on the general election, even though they might not have technically be of age. So, you know, and Vermonters overwhelmingly supported that constitutional amendment. It was 81% to 19%. And it was just another way for us to engage our young adults in this state. And other states are starting to follow. And I just think it's a great thing. But you're absolutely right. And, you know, unfortunately, the word compromise has gotten a bad connotation over the last probably 20, 25 years. It used to be, I mean, I can remember Senator George Aiken meeting, you know, conservative Republican from Vermont, meeting with Senator Mike Mansfield from, I think it's Montana, back in the 60s. They used to meet every Friday morning for breakfast to kind of hash out, okay, what can we do with this bill? Can we find a way to a path forward on this bill? And I think it's important. I don't think, and frankly, I don't see, you know, I know the other side constantly tells us that, you know, we got to watch out for this super majority, but frankly, I think the Democrats in this particular instance have actually been welcoming to other views, to the progressive views, to the Republican views on issues. They may not side with them in the end, but I think they listen, and I think that's a testament to Vermont, but also a testament to the State House. As I always used to say when I was a senator, there's 180 members over in that State House, and all 180 members are there because they're trying to do what's right for their constituents. And we just may have different ways of getting there, but we're all working hard for Vermonters.
It really, I don't know if I had that full perspective until I got into the State House, and it really does feel true once you're there. So in the primary, when we have constituents, when we have voters turning out and really participating in the process, then those smaller debates around the issues that then play out in the State House get to be played out in communities. And so I'm curious from you, when we have this incredibly increased turnout, in a lot of ways because it's easier to vote or because we're reminding people to vote, when it comes straight to your house and gets to sit there on your table for, at least for me, enough weeks that the envelope got stuck together from the humidity. How do you think that changes people's process when they are voting? Like the lead up to the vote, the thought process?
Well, it's not just the lead up to the vote. I think it's also how the candidates respond.
Yeah.
I think there's a dual function going on here, but first of all, back to your comment about when we have such a strong turnout, my belief, and I hope that a lot of Vermonters share this, I think they do, my belief is the more people who vote, the stronger our democracy. And I really truly believe that. I do get frustrated when people say, well, I'm not going to vote for this ticket or this person because they don't agree with me on this issue. Mm-hmm. Nobody should be a one issue. We should never have one issue campaigns because there's so much more to it. We're all involved in the different things, as you know, Emily. If you were just there for one reason and one reason only, mm-hmm. you're going to become irrelevant very quickly. Mm-hmm. You have to be knowledgeable. You have to want to learn what the other side is saying and how can we incorporate. And that's why I say compromise is not a bad word. Compromise is actually a good word. Mm-hmm. Compromise is actually how legislation gets passed. Mm-hmm. And when people on both sides dig their heels in, we have what we have in Congress right now, where they can't even talk to each other. They can't be in the same room with each other without yelling and screaming. And it's unfortunate. I think it's really, really unfortunate. And I'd like to say that Vermont can lead the way here.
So, I think you bring up a good point, Secretary Condos, because around compromise, because we forget that one of the main things our elected officials need to do is build policy. And the process of compromise is what happens when you get a lot of people at the table, ideally, with all their points of view, and then they find their common ground and what's best for the policy and the people at the end. Why? And I'm sorry, Emily, I know you have a question, but
it's fine, Olga.
Why has compromise gotten a dirty word if one of the things we're trying to do in Vermont is make sure we get as many diverse voices to the table as possible?
My personal opinion is people stop listening. And when people stop listening, you start to see the heels getting dug in. And I think this went back to the 90s, frankly. And then again in 2010, and I don't want to get into politics too much here, but, in the 90s, it was the contract with America. And then in 2010, it was the Tea Party. And it was the no holds barred, no compromise. We're going to ram through what we want. We saw that at my national association. Some of the folks who were Tea Party secretaries who got elected in that sweep in 2010 tried to ram stuff through. And to be honest with you, it was the veteran Republicans who stopped it. And they said, that's not the way we do business. And I think, we have Republicans, Democrats, and progressives in this state, as well as independents. And we're all trying to do what we think is right for our constituents. We have to find ways to overcome that. That's why, I served 18 years. I think both of you know this, but I served 18 years on a city council. I served 8 years in the state senate. I chaired 2 committees in the state senate, education and government operations. And to this day, I maintain that the legislature should be setting us the policy they want us to follow, but then they need to step away and let the secretaries, the commissioners, managers actually get into the weeds and find the details that implement that policy. I think where we get, and don't take me wrong, Emily, but I think when we start having legislatures, and I'm not accusing ours of doing that yet, but when we have when legislatures start getting down in the weeds and actually figuring out how we're going to do these things, when we start to have the problems. And I remember one day, just even back early in my secretary career, we were talking about campaign finance, and one of the members, I won't say who, but one of the members actually was trying to literally put into statute the form that we would use to capture campaign finance. And I said, no, I pushed back hard. And I said, no, what you need to do is tell me what it is you want me to capture. I'll figure out how we get there. And, to think about putting a form into statute, it flies in the face of good legislation.
I think both the conversation around compromise and what you're saying right now is this whole idea of needing to separate ends and means. And we agree on the ends, we compromise on the means. And that's how, good compromise happens. And with legislation, the legislation is about the ends, the goal, and then the folks administering the work are the ones who figure out the means based on all the conversations they're having with whoever they're serving. Towards the details, you pulled off a really successful election logistically as well. And I think that's really important for folks to understand. I'm happy to have town clerks with us in the legislature who, along with my town clerk, help me understand some of the mechanics of what absentee voting looks like in a normal year and what you were able to do this year with really being the backstop for the town clerks and being able to do a much broader mailing, being able to do more processing, that kind of thing that they don't necessarily have the capacity to leap into. And I think it's a great example of what we need to be doing in this time of COVID, that our larger state entities or our statewide entities can be backstops for some local decision making, but also supporting that work. And so I'm wondering what you've learned in this time and through this process that we're going to see in the general election, especially with all of the controversy around the Postal Service.
Yes. So, and I was going to bring that up in my response to you on this one, but so I'll have to. But I think I really think that first off, we listened. We listened to the town clerks. We listened to the legislature. We explained to the legislature what it was we wanted to do. As an example, when Act 92 and Act 135 were passed, it was to enable my office to be able to move quickly, nimbly, and flexibly to meet the needs that voters would have and clerks around the whole situation of the pandemic. And we recognize that we didn't really have that authority, and the current law would have hindered us. So we needed that flexibility, and that's what the work that the legislature did to provide that authority to me really helped a lot. Secondly, I know Will and my elections team were meeting with Postal Service. I forget it's someone who's in charge of coordinating the election and campaign related mail. They've been meeting weekly since probably, I'd say early to mid-April on a weekly basis. And as we got closer to the election, even more so. That included the design for our envelope. When we asked about paying the postage, which is another factor, by the way, that really assisted making it easier for people, was that the state paid for that postage, which usually was a cost picked up by the towns. And then, the clerks wanted to be, it was kind of split as to how this all was going to work, but they wanted to be the ones who sent out the ballots. And we said, well, look, we can't do anything about that now for the primary. We can work towards the general election. So really, we've been working on two different elections, up to this point. And I can tell you that my elections staff, which is the smallest in the country, we have 5 people, and Will and his staff have been working literally 50, 60 hours a week for the last 4 months. It's not unusual for Will and I and Chris Winters, my deputy, to have emails passing back and forth over the weekend or at night. I mean, it's just a constant. We've been constantly working on all the logistics, but we reached out to the experts. We reached out to the folks who were going to print the envelopes that we needed, and there are different size envelopes in that batch. We had to talk about, okay, how many ballots do we print since we're doing this? Is there waste that comes out because of it? Sure, but we're guessing at how many people will come out. Then we have to also deal with the post office as far as the prepaid postage, the mail house for the general election. All these things are things that we had to work on as we went. And it was.
Can you make sure that you tell our listeners exactly what the general election is going to look like? Because I want to make sure that we cover that.
Sure. So what we did in the primary is we sent a prepaid postcard out and with a prepaid postcard, return postcard to your town clerk. That was done through a mail house and to alleviate, because we were sending out 450,000 of those postcards to active registered voters. So we did that first. That was the only change to the primary election. Everything else about the primary election was the same. It was just that postcard. And that helped, as I said earlier, to drive the increase. For the general election, we're going to do, again, one other thing. And that's it's really just an option for Vermont voters. But we're going to directly mail a ballot to each active registered voter so that they have the ballot in their hand. How they get that ballot back is going to be up to them. They can put it in the mail because it'll be a prepaid postage coming back. They can deliver it to their town clerk's office as they normally would, or walk in with it. They can bring it to the polls or actually go to the polls and vote. There's nothing else that's changing. It's just the one act is we're sending a ballot to every registered voter. And the whole idea of that was to make it provide voters with an additional option. And you know, as I do want to make clear that we had 2 overarching goals in all of our decision making over the last 5 or 6 months. 1, protect the eligible voters' right to cast a ballot, and 2, to protect the health and safety of not only our voters, but also our town clerks and poll workers.
Thank you. Emily, you had, when we were talking off air, you had a question about the 2 different hats that Secretary Condos wears. Mm-hmm. So I was hoping you could just touch on that, Secretary Condos, because you do have multiple roles within our state.
Yep. And, you know, first of all, let me just say this and say it very clearly. Mm-hmm. I run this office in a nonpartisan fashion, and I think Emily can attest to that. I think that if you go across the street to the legislature, you can talk to Republicans, Democrats, and progressives and independents, and they'll all say that I'm fair, I listen, and we treat everybody the same. So that's the first thing I would say. Then, obviously, I am elected as a Democrat. I choose to run as a Democrat. I have a Republican opponent. And that's a fact of life, and you just have to be able to separate those things. You know, I do not take when I'm in my office or in my official role as Secretary of State, I do not do any political campaigning, unlike someone in Washington right now. I don't use this office as a bully pulpit. I use my position as a bully pulpit outside of the building, but I don't, you know, I really follow strictly, in my view, the ethical code that we all should be following. You know, and Olga, when I was a state senator, I actually worked for a utility whenever anything came up that would benefit that utility, even though I was not financially involved as far as what that measure might do, I forget the rule, I think it was Rule 78 or something, and I would announce that under Rule 78, I was not going to act on this bill. There was another colleague of mine in the Senate from the Northeast Kingdom, Jim Greenwood, who also, he was a Republican. He was on the board of one of the electric utilities. And anything that had to do with electrical, he would not vote either. He and we often would do it probably sometimes on the same bill because it might be a general legislation. So, I think everybody has to deal with this on their own as far as conflicts of interest and political aspects. It is a balancing act, and there's no question. You have to really work to do that. And I think it's important that people do remember that as well.
We have just about 5 minutes left before we need to go to break. So I want to check in, Emily or Secretary Condos. Is there anything we want to kind of wrap up this half hour with?
I'm curious, given that we're mailing a ballot to every single registered voter in the state, who is registered in the state and who isn't?
So that's a great question, Emily, because we have, first of all, we have about 489 or 490,000 total voters registered in the state out of a population of 625,000, which is, if you can figure the numbers out, it works out just about right. If you take the 0 to 18, mm-hmm. We have a good idea how many people there are. So the first thing is, I think there's been a concerted effort by many in this state to register voters. Secondly, in 2017, we implemented the automatic voter registration, which is really a file upload we get from the Department of Motor Vehicles. When you think about going to Motor Vehicle Department to get your driver's license, you're going there, they ask you to show your proof of citizenship, to show your where you live in Vermont and how old you are. Guess what? That's the same 3 questions we ask for voter registration. So it's an opt-out scenario where people can opt out if they don't want to be registered, and there are people who do not want to be registered. But we get a daily upload from the Department of Motor Vehicle of the previous day's transactions with people updating their either updating or getting a new driver's license in the state. And then we also know we get the ones that are flagged as opt-out are not sent to us at all, but we match it up against our current voter registration list, and it helps us keep that registration list more up to date. Because believe it or not, people do have a tendency to go to motor vehicles to get their address on their license changed because they moved, but they don't necessarily go to their town clerk to change their voting address. So it does provide another level for us. Those postcards that we used also provides another level. So I think, I don't know if I got the full answer here for you, but we have a pretty strong, I know there's a few people out there that we have one individual up in the Chittenden County area who over the last 4 or 5 years has registered over 1,300 voters. He's not ashamed. He unabashedly goes up to people and just say, "Are you registered to vote? I can do it for you right now." And it's, we've taken the approach here in the state of Vermont to make it easier to vote.
So my understanding is that folks with past felony convictions, folks who are incarcerated, folks who have non-driver IDs, all are also eligible to vote, and people can register to vote at the polls. And so what I was really struck by when I was knocking on people's doors, I wasn't knocking by voter rolls. I was just going to each door, which I know is not sort of traditional strategy, but was the strange way I decided to run my first election. And I only met one or two people out of my entire, third of a town that were not registered to vote. And two of those were people who adamantly had no interest in registering to vote. So it's incredible because across the country, we see this big push for access. And where we are in Vermont, I think thanks to your leadership in a lot of ways, is we're really the next step of getting people to getting people to the next step of engaging in each election. And that's a huge win.
It really is. And that really has been our focus. First of all, the big pushback has always been about voter fraud. And that's what they use to put all these restrictions with strict voter ID. Only certain types of ID can be used, with purging of voter rolls. We have laws that we had to follow, and we do follow those. But I think what I tell people constantly, and Emily, you probably heard me say this, but the true voter fraud in this country, the true voter fraud is the denial of any eligible American the right to cast a ballot. That is a constitutional right, and nobody should be denied. And I'll hear people. I actually had someone come see me. A very educated woman came to see me one day and said to me, I'm really concerned that some of these people really don't understand the issues. And I think we should have some kind of a test that they have to take before they can vote. And I looked at her, my eyes went big, and I said, "Are you kidding me?" It's a constitutional right. It doesn't matter whether you know nothing about the issue, you still have a right to vote.
Before we wrap up,
okay,
can I have a final question?
Yeah,
that I think Brattleboro folks really care deeply about. So we had a ballot measure a few years ago that gave 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote, charter change, the right to vote in our local elections. And we managed to move that through the House finally. Charter changes are sometimes a little slow to go through. It's quite controversial. And now it's sort of been lost in the COVID crossover mess where many pieces of legislation got dropped. But curious about your thoughts on the 16 and 17-year-olds voting.
Well, first I would say that, I actually am not, let me put it this way. I visit high schools, I visit grade schools, middle schools, and talk to the kids about the right to vote, about government, about civics. We have to engage our youth. And I think that one of the things that has really concerned me, I was chair of education when No Child Left Behind came into play. And I remember that one of the things, because civics was not part of the curriculum that No Child Left Behind was dealing with, schools started dropping civics, and eventually the State Agency of Education dropped civics from its coordination. And I think that was a mistake. And frankly, I believe we should do everything we can to engage our young adults, our youth, because they are the future. As much as, Emily, you're one of the young ones and I'm one of the old ones, it's not going to be long before that role changes.
I am not that young. I'm only young in the context of Vermont politics, right? I am in my 40s. Like, I am a middle-aged woman to the whole rest of the world. It's one of the funniest things about being in the legislature.
So yeah, I think it's important that we do engage our youth. And I think whether 16 and 17-year-olds can vote in local elections, that's really up to the local jurisdiction, and then of course the legislature. It's the same with non-citizens. You have a couple of, I think Montpelier and Winooski may be putting it back on their ballot, citizens to vote. First of all, it's not a new concept. Non-citizens voting was actually the norm prior to about 1920. It was after 1920 that started to go away. And the whole idea, okay, I get it. There is a constitutional amendment that would need to be made to change it for federal and state races, but there isn't for local races. And that really should be up to the towns to do that. And frankly, some of you may or may not know, but I'm second generation American. All four of my grandparents came from overseas. And so it's to me, it's personal. It's, I really believe that I'm so sickened by what's going on around this country over immigration. That's a whole nother topic.
Yes. Next time.
Yes.
Let's do that. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, Secretary Condos, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and Wyndham, go forward.
Thank you.
Take care.
You.
Take care.
We'll return after a moment. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. And the second half, it is Emily Kornheiser and I talking about how things in Montpelier shake out for Windham County. Welcome back, Emily.
Thanks, Olga. That was a fun conversation we had with Secretary Condos.
I always like talking to him.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't think elections should be fascinating, like the process and the logistics, but they always are. But I think it's because, at the end of the conversation, Condos was talking a lot about access. And I think elections and the logistics behind elections remind me a lot about budgets, in the sense that budgets reflect our priorities as a community about what we are willing to spend money on or not spend money on. Mm-hmm. And I think access to voting also reflects a lot of our priorities as a community.
I agree. I think it's the logistics are interesting because there's such a deep ethical consideration with each detail, right? Mm-hmm. So now that I think Secretary Condos was very careful, since he was in his office and in his official role, to sort of stay on the non-political side. But I think it's interesting to think about how increased voter access and increased engagement changes the way people make voting decisions. And we didn't really talk about that very much. So when ballots are mailed to people and we have more people voting, we have more people who are looking for information about voting and about the candidates. We have more people who are a little more disengaged from the process who are voting. We have the election cycle becomes more extended, because when the ballots were mailed out, they were mailed out, and in the general election, this will be true too. The ballots are going to be mailed out in September.
Right.
And they're not due until November. And so that extends this, the time that candidates are trying to engage with voters, and voters are making that decision. So usually it's like a long ramp up and everything's on November, in November on election day. Right. But we're going to have like 2 months of intensity while people are, checking those boxes. And so, there's questions about, like, is it good for the Democrats? Or is it good for the left? Which is sort of an interesting question. There's in my family, and I think this is like a general Jewish joke, like, is it good for the Jews, which is sort of like, after hundreds of years of having like slight political changes lead to pogroms or, right. Whatever else, like people being kicked out of cities, let back in cities, kicked out of cities, let back in cities. The, like, is it good for the Jews is a big cultural question. And so it's funny in the context of this election to be like, well, is it good for the Democrats, and does it matter if it's, the right thing to do? So, yeah, those are all the questions I'm sort of sitting with about these changes in elections.
Well, what I just found what you said about parties really interesting, because one thing when Condos was talking about his role as a Democrat / Secretary of State, I was thinking about how fascinating it is, because in Vermont, I think people identify with where they sit on the political spectrum, but that doesn't always translate into a party identity.
No, it really doesn't.
Yeah, we don't have strong party identities, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Well, you don't even register with a party here, which you do in a lot of other states.
Exactly. You don't even have to register with a party for the primary, which you do in most states. And so it gets me thinking, like what you were just saying, is it good for the Democrats? I mean, is it? Do people even think that way?
I think people definitely think that way. But I think part of it might be because access to the voting booth or access to the ballot is one of those issues that's become sort of an identity politics politicized issue that, from my perspective, is absurd that it's become one of those issues. Like masks are another one. Like, really? Masks are going to be about identity politics and not about public health? And voting is another one of those. And I'm like, I wish we didn't have to politicize this issue, I wish some of us weren't defending this and others of us weren't attacking this. And so the states that have really dynamic voter access tend to be states with that vote further left. And so it's hard to figure out the correlation causation.
Right.
But generally, people say that if more people turn out in an election, it tends to go better for go more towards Democrats. But in Vermont, where people tend to bullet vote, tend to split their ticket, meaning they vote for a Republican in one spot on the ticket and a Democrat in another spot on the ticket, and a progressive in another spot on the ticket. Every once in a while, I throw in a Liberty Union vote.
Why not?
And so, Jerry Levy is a person very, who I really believe in. So I think, I wonder if that, plays out the same way in Vermont because of the way people split their ticket. And if Vermonters will continue to split their ticket as the national landscape becomes even more polarized.
Good question. Good question. Well, I think you raised such a good point about how Vermonters vote, because I think we often split the ticket because we tend to identify more with candidates than we do with party. And you're right. I certainly will vote across party lines from time to time. Not so much on the state level, but definitely on the local level. So
I'm really, when we say we care more about candidates, and I'm thinking about the conversation we had last week about women's suffrage, and I listened to a few of those other interviews that you did with female politicians in the area about women's suffrage.
Or female office holders.
Female
as well.
office holders. Yeah. What's the difference between an office holder and a politician?
When you said politician, because we're in the middle of election, that made me go to candidates. And we're not just talking to candidates. We're talking to people who are already sitting in a position of power.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So
Thank
anyway,
you for clarifying.
Absolutely. So when people vote when Vermonters are more interested in the person than the party, does that mean that they're more interested in the policies that person happens to be holding on to?
I don't think so.
It's a big tent. I certainly have very different, values and policies I'm putting forward than, some of my colleagues around the state, or even my colleagues within the county. But you're shaking your head no. Our radio listeners can't see you're shaking. But that was a weary shake no.
If I think I know where you were going, I would personally love it if everyone cared about the policies and what kind of leadership they were voting in, and whether someone was good at building policy. I think, however, when I said people tend to care more about the candidates, I get the impression, and this is just my impression, that it's personality driven. I think last week or on another conversation, you mentioned that someone said, "Oh yeah, I'd like to have a beer with so-and-so." And yeah, that's nice to think you could have that good a relationship with someone in a position of power. but I don't think that should be the main criteria.
Well, what should be the main criteria?
The main criteria is, for me anyways, does this person's goals align with the values that I hold? And can they get to those goals, aka build policy, that is collaborative and serves as many people as possible, as well as possible?
You know, it's, I really appreciate that you said that. So it's, do their goals and values align with mine, but also can they get to those goals? It's been interesting for me, you know, just finishing up my second year, my first biennium, if it actually this biennium ever finishes up. But, you know, last election cycle, I was the newbie with the fresh voice and the fresh face and the fresh ideas. And I could say, you know, I could fight for justice, and nuance did not need to be as available because I wasn't aware of how, you know, in some ways, how incredibly difficult it is to get anything done in the legislature, or what competing interests really feel like in my body when I'm trying to move something forward. Not my competing interests, but the competing interests of my colleagues. But actually sometimes my own competing interests. So it's really interesting to see how new candidates can be so clear on like, these are the problems we have and I'm going to go solve them. Whereas, you know, after a few years, and I think the longer you're in there, the harder it is to say, these are the problems and I'm going to go solve them, rather than these are the problems. Here are some possible solutions that I see, and here are the challenges with those solutions, and here's what I'm going to need from you to get it done. And that's like so much less exciting.
Yeah. It's necessary, but it's not exciting. I think that's one thing why people disengage from democracy sometimes, is good democracy, I think at least, is dynamic, but it's also deliberative and it's slow. And if you're really doing diligence and making sure that as many diverse experiences and people are at the table, and as many community members are considered as possible that you're trying to serve, that takes time to gather that information, and those experiences takes time. And I think so often what we want as communities is we want that 2-minute Hollywood montage where it's all, yay, fight against the power, and yay, we won.
What's the music that plays in the background of the montage?
Oh, well, it's got to be something like Rocky's, you know,
with the steps,
Eye of the Tiger, or real like 80s ballad power music.
It's not Beyonce. So
it should be Beyonce, but it never is.
Never is. Never is. Maybe when more women make movies. So that, what I think is interesting about that we sort of crave that clarity and that excitement as voters. But what I heard from so many people when I was knocking on doors 2 years ago, no knocking on doors this year. Thank you, COVID, for ruining my summer and everyone else's.
Yes.
So many people were like, you know, politicians have been making promises to me my whole life and my life hasn't changed at all. So like, why should I bother caring? Why should I vote? And so there's really those sort of competing interests of like being real with people to build trust and just for honesty's sake, and so that people can really understand how the process works and can see themselves in it, and how to do that in, you know, 45 seconds or less, because none of us have time and we're all seeking the next adrenaline hit.
Adrenaline hit. Wow, that was very powerful. One of the reasons I don't like the 24-hour news cycle, because I think it keeps viewers up on an adrenaline stress high rather than giving them time to process the information before they get the next hit of new information. Which I guess brings me back to what you were just saying. It makes me think that we need to change how we communicate policy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we so often talk about the nuts and bolts of it when maybe we should be talking a little bit more about the intent behind it.
Mm-hmm.
And the goals. Like maybe we
Mm-hmm.
don't do that well enough when we're and when I say we, I'm talking folks who work in the media and whose job it is to communicate these things, but also the legislators when they talk about these things.
And I don't want to be a broken record, but I think it again gets to the ends and the means, and
Mm-hmm.
how we spend so much time talking about the ends and arguing about the ends and like diving in and nosing our way around the ends and really forget about, with the means, and like really forget about the ends and why any of us are showing up for this. So if every voter is going to get a ballot in their mailbox, and all of our lives are, you know, chaos and fairly filled with stress and adrenaline.
Mm-hmm.
And as my friend Carrie Storm said, we are just a small whisper in the storm of someone's life. She was talking about something completely different, but it is one of my
really
favorite
beautiful
metaphors forever about everything. What is it going to look like to really... one, what does it look like in the time of COVID to have this be an engaged election cycle? And then even more so, if we're going to continue doing this, which I certainly hope we do, and I know a lot of people hope we do, I really think it means that we can't just save the politicking for an election year, but in fact, it needs to be an all year round conversation.
Well, isn't that what, oh my gosh, I forgot her name. One of our early guests who writes about Vermont.
Meg Mott?
No.
Oh, with the democracy.
Yes.
What was her name? We're terrible.
So sorry. She's so awesome. And I'm completely like, but to that point, she co-wrote Slow Democracy, for folks who are wondering. You know, she says that town meeting needs to be more than just one day a year.
Mm-hmm.
That the community needs to be engaging around town issues long before they show up.
Susan Clark.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for Googling that while I was talking. Susan Clark. We appreciate you, Susan. And I do recommend you check out her book, Slow Democracy, if you haven't. But it's that same concept that you can't just show up one day in March and expect to have a deep understanding of what why the town budget looks the way it does.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
No, and we can't just show up in November and think that we're going to have elected officials who represent our thoughts if we don't take the time. If elected officials don't take the time to engage with citizens about their thoughts, and if citizens don't have the time to engage with elected officials. Mm-hmm. So we need to fix the economy so everyone has time, and we need to fix our communication and resources. And so we're going to do that tomorrow. Yeah. And in the meantime, what else what did we learn about this primary cycle? Like, what did we learn? Tuesday. Today's what? Today's Friday. Mm-hmm. The election was on Tuesday. Most of the results came in by like 10. I feel like I got to sleep pretty early that night.
Yes. I think what
happened in Windham County.
What happened in Windham County?
Yeah, like.
You mean
with the election? Races? Yeah.
Oh goodness, we only have a couple minutes left, and there's still so much to talk about with that.
Okay,
one.
Well, I'll put away that thought. Let's save that. I know we're going to talk to one of my colleagues, Selena Colburn,
Yes.
about this race. So let's save that conversation.
We're gonna
for
save
then.
that.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. Well,
Jumping ahead.
the brain is starting to, my second cup of coffee has kicked in.
Mhm.
I think what I learned two things with this primary. One, when you make access easier, i.e. people go to their mailbox and pull out a ballot and it is right there, that the more easy you make things for people, the fewer barriers they have, the better turnout you get.
Mhm.
So that's kind of like a no-brainer. But I also learned, because I went to my post office, pulled out my ballot, it sat on my desk, I even filled it out ahead of time, and then at like 6 o'clock on August 11th, I looked at my desk and went, oh no! And had to quickly drive up to the town center before polls closed at 7. So it also reminds me.
That's awesome.
Thank you, Lori, town clerk for Dummerston, for being there while ago. I'm sorry. But it reminds me that part of that access also requires a flexible process, because some people probably pulled that ballot right out of the mailbox, filled it out, put it right in, and off it went within the same day. But then you got people like me who, time, deadlines.
Yeah, no, mine certainly sat on my desk for at least a month, maybe a little bit more. And as I said earlier, all the envelopes got very stuck together and I had to rip them. And I called the clerk and I'm like, is this still valid? Like, everything's very taped together.
That just warmed my heart to know I'm not the only
Yeah. I did turn it in on time, though, as did you.
I did.
You, yes.
As did I.
Yes.
But yeah, that access is about not only lowering barriers, but realizing that not everyone can respond in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of what I learned, I think.
Mm-hmm. And that we still need, even with access, we still need to break through the noise of people's lives.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's all of our responsibilities.
And I think that is worth, along with the thought we're going to save for your colleague, we should really talk about what does engagement look like. Mm-hmm. What does an engaged voter look like, but what does an engaged legislator look like? Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
there are so many different takes on that, whether it's about engaging the electorate or winning the election. Those are two very different things to do. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if everyone's aware of that sort of. No. But with limited resources, those are two different things to do.
Yes. Yeah. Very good point. Mm-hmm. So we are out of time.
How does that happen?
I know. It just went. Mm-hmm. So I want to make a toast for today's Montpelier happy hour. I want to toast to access and keeping the barriers low and keeping the tent door wide open for everyone. Salud.
Cheers. I've been putting lemon basil in my water and it's delicious. I highly recommend.
Looking at that.
Mm-hmm. It's really good.
Mm-hmm. Lemon basil. Okay.
Lemon basil. Mm-hmm.
Where do you find that?
I got it from my CSA.
Okay.
It might be the only week I got it. I might not get it this week, and then what will happen? Who knows?
New creativity will have to kick in.
Indeed.
That's all the time we have for today's Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can find us on the Vermontitude SoundCloud page, as well as the Vermontitude Facebook page, and 2 p.m. here on this station, as well as Emily's YouTube channel. So, Emily, where can people find you?
Seems like there are so many places these days, and they're all
it's about access.
The computer. So, EmilyKornheiser.org. You can find me, Emily Kornheiser, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Give me a call. My phone number's on my website. I think that covers it.
It does.
It does.
Have a good weekend, everybody. Have a good weekend, Emily.
You too, Olga.